So the topic of B&I's talk today is redefining the role of EAP in the era of EMI and rapidly expanding transnational education, which we know is a key focus at the moment for UK universities amidst dwindling international student recruitment. We are also co-presenting with Jingwen Zhou, and Jingwen and Paolo will also be presenting virtually today in the hybrid stream of the conference today. And the focus of our talk is actually a paper that we've recently submitted for a special issue on critical issues in EAP. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So just a little background, we all know the landscape, the radical transformation in higher education, the internationalisation of higher education has become synonymous with the Englishisation of higher education in non-Anglophone contexts. The rapidly growing phenomenon of English medium instruction and TNE has led to a language transformation in universities around the globe. Despite the fact that the relatively new field of EMI and the very well-established field of EAP, we see a flourishing scholarship, policy implementation and provision is still rapidly outpacing empirical research. The focus of our talk today is actually going to be on China, where we collected data. And we're going to introduce, where Jingwen collected the data, and we'll talk about some of the findings from the interview data today. But I think this is a really, a topic that obviously has relevance globally, and we'll draw on some other contexts throughout the talk as well. So as I mentioned, the introduction of English medium instruction and also rapidly growing TNE of late has been one of the most significant developments in higher education systems worldwide over the past 2 decades. If we look at the Chinese context, we see a number of policy milestones for EMI in China. So way back in 2001, the Ministry of Education mandate stipulated that 5 to 10% of undergraduate courses should be taught in English. English is seen as a key tool here for internationalization, a key part of the modernization agenda. With all of these different policies, and also if we look at the recent development in Vietnam with the role of English as a second language, the bilingual 2030 policy in Taiwan, on a global level, we have these top-down policies implementing English as a second language in some contexts, but really it's become a key KPI indicator as part of the internationalization agenda of higher education. We see that the provision of English being a key indicator for institutional quality. In Vietnam, somewhat problematically, the English medium instruction programs are labelled as advanced programs or high quality programs. In the Thai context, they're labelled as international programs. So what we see then is this assumption that simply because the program is delivered in English, that it equates to a higher quality degree program. I have a lot of topics I'd like to cover on the need for more critical inquiry into EMI, but the focus today is on EAP and the role of the EAP practitioner. Of course, we have diverse models of EMI implementation and also TNE. I've been attending a lot of webinars recently delivered by the British Council and elsewhere, and we see that universities in the UK now are sharing the various models of TNE. And it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach to both TNE and EMI. In China, we have different types of provisions, so EMI universities, EMI colleges, EMI programs. And what we've tried to do in the data that Jingwen collected is have a range of these institutions in the data collection as well. So TNE is accelerating in the Chinese context, and I think with the recent UK announcement, I think we're also going to see expanding TNE from UK universities as well, almost seen as a lifeline of our universities amidst dwindling international student recruitment. It's certainly a key focus at the moment. In my own university, I've recently stepped into the role as Director of Global Engagement, so there's a lot of focus here on TNE and our models and also our approach to thinking about internationalization. And I think, as most of us would agree, universities in the UK have had quite a narrow view of what it means to be international and what internationalisation means in higher education. And we're now looking for more longer-term strategies for more successful and sustainable TNE policy. So since 2004, China's experienced a significant growth in transnational higher education. This initiative is integral to the internationalisation at home strategy, and perhaps also impacting on our recruitment of Chinese international students as well. And again, this is a phenomenon that we're seeing with the internationalisation at home agenda in countries around the globe. Again, as well as EMI having different models, we see different forms of transnational education provision in China. So from joint educational institutes, with jointly established universities awarding foreign or dual degrees, and also joint education programs as well. So I think it's important in our data collection that we do look at the different forms that TNE takes. We have numerous extensive partnerships in the Chinese context, so I'm just looking at my time. By 2020, we had over 600 Chinese universities collaborating with more than 800 foreign institutions. So I think really that this doesn't just call for a look at who's leading on the implementation of these policies, whose expertise are we drawing on in terms of curriculum planning, in terms of our needs analysis as well, and our support mechanisms. But I think also this language transformation in higher education also has a lot of implications for international collaboration and co-curriculum design. We see joint programs surging, and again, I think with the UK focus, we're going to see a lot more joint programs in the future. In the Chinese context, by the end of 2019, there were 2,238 joint programs. By 2023, China hosted about 1,400 undergraduate, nearly 300 graduate joint programs. So we have this extensive collaboration, and this is fundamentally transforming language use and language policy within the Chinese higher education landscape. Of course, the field of EAP has a much, much longer history than the relatively new subfield of EMI research. And I'll come back to that because that's really what prompted BNI to collaborate here when we met in China at the Ningbo EAP conference. So we have an explosion of EMI research if we just look at the sheer number of papers. So this is from Tim Hampson's recent PhD study. We see research looking at attitudes, the challenges for students and staff, describing EMI, the effects, which I think is very important because we still lack longitudinal research looking at particularly the impact of EMI on English proficiency and the outcomes. Does it actually lead to a better quality, a so-called higher quality education? And as we know, one of the key driving forces is the perceived benefit and the relationship between EMI and perceived English proficiency improvement. We see research looking at the growth of EMI, language use in the classroom, pedagogy, and also strategies for both policy implementation and classroom level pedagogic strategies. I've just picked out a few studies. Obviously there's a lot of research at the moment. So we see some key studies looking at the driving forces behind EMI in different contexts, the predictors of success, EMI policy analysis, and in our study we did also look at document analysis. Jingwen collected a lot of documents from the institutions, student-related challenges and also teacher-related challenges. Now, in terms of the challenges, what we've seen is a growing calls within the field of EMI that resonate with a lot of the research in the field of EAP, calling for the need for more discipline-specific language support for EMI students, but also the need for more collaboration between EMI teachers and content teachers that EAP researchers have been calling for years in Anglophone contexts. And really, if EMI and TNE are to achieve their stated goals of enhancing teaching quality and global competitiveness, then language support cannot remain peripheral, but must be structurally embedded within programme design. So despite these increased calls on the need for more EAP support, we still see that support is lacking. And if we think about McCarroll's models of language support in EMI programmes, we still have this very ostrich model where universities are simply burying their heads in the sand and ignoring that these challenges exist for students. So as I mentioned, Bea and I first met back in 2023 at the EAP conference. And we approached this from different places. We were operating in different fields. I would say at the time that EMI researchers, we had this silo mentality that we weren't really drawing on research from the field in EAP. And I've since called for more of a cross-fertilisation of the two fields in the debate that we had in the ELT journal with Angela Hakim and Ursula Wingate and Heath Rose. So since 2003, Bea and I have been talking about the two plenaries that we gave there and how we can come together more in our work and look at tackling some of these challenges and trying to drive both of the fields forward to both enhance the cross-fertilisation of our fields, but also to look at this changing landscape, particularly with movements towards TNE as well. And as I mentioned, we are collaborating with Jing Wen, who's also presenting today. And we've put this together into a couple of papers, and one of these is the special issue on critical issues for EAP in higher education. And I'll pass over to Bea now, and I think I'm going to transition your slides.
Do I need to unmute myself? Do I press it? Yeah. Okay, can I just check that people online can hear me as well then? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so as Nicola said, she's the EMI expert, and I am going to begin this by kind of saying I do feel very much like an imposter, and I'm very aware that there are people in the room in my own institution who are much more knowledgeable about the TNE and EMI context. I'm possibly one of very few people that haven't from Leeds been out to Chengdu, which is our partnership sort of joint school over there, and I've got my colleague Joanne Shield who has kind of led on that since it began. So I am an imposter in this sense. What I'm bringing here is the kind of context of EAP within the UK and kind of how I think we can learn from what's happening within the UK and kind of extrapolate and kind of think about what that means within EMI and TNE context, because I think it's more complex in a TNE context, but we're dealing with the same kind of issues really. And the issues are, there are multiple definitions of what EAP is. The one at the top is the most commonly quoted. And it kind of tells us what we do, but it's so vague that it could mean anything. And I think that this is the issue that we have as EAP practitioners still, that we don't really have an agreed knowledge base. And this is the Alex Ding, Ian Bruce and myself have been talking about this now for quite a number of years, that we're not really sure what our own academic authority is, where we draw from that knowledge. Interest in EAP is expanding, as Nicola said, because of EMI and TNE. It's growing globally, it's shrinking in the UK, and we're kind of dealing with a growing interest in discipline specificity. It's generally agreed that that's the best approach to working with students, but it's really difficult to achieve. Partly difficult to achieve because of collaboration, but also difficult to achieve because it means that we need to know things that we don't necessarily know from our previous training. And I don't mean here we need to know about chemistry or civil engineering. We need to understand how those disciplines think, build knowledge, and how they communicate that. But it's difficult work to do. And to do it requires a huge number of resources as well. And it requires us to be positioned in a place where we've got academic authority that is equal to those people that are working within those disciplines. Can you move the slides along, please? So really, this needs this kind of academic knowledge, the sort of knowledge base of what we draw on is the gap that we're dealing with, I think, as EAP practitioners. And it's what Alex Ding and Ian Bruce and I would argue is kind of what keeps us marginalised, that we lack this academic authority. And it's that we need to take into a university to be able to be seen as equal partners and to be able to influence broader policy and curriculum, because it's academic authority that speaks within a university. We can't go in and talk about having expertise without being specific about what our expertise is and being able to demonstrate it. in the ways that the university requires us to demonstrate it. So I think what's clear is that EAP in TNE context brings most of these similar issues, but it's more complex. The lack of academic authority is kind of due to this lack of knowledge base, and it's not an easy thing to remedy. So I think if we move on to the next slide, which is hopefully a very quick one, because there are three core reasons that I would say are that feed into this inability to influence, this inability to kind of be seen on an equal footing. It's the structural positioning, it's our contractual status, and it's the lack of specific EAP qualifications. So I think the next slides are going to talk through those three and break them down. They all feed in and out of each other, so the kind of linear doesn't go in that line particularly, it's sort of more circular. Where we sit in the UK is not clear. I was talking to Will earlier about Sheffield, and they're moving currently from professional services into a faculty, into a school. Glenn Fulcher years ago looked and did a survey of where language centres, EAP units were positioned, and we're all over the place. Nobody knows where we sit, nobody knows where we belong. That's weird, you know, and it's weird because we don't know what we do, who we are, what is our academic knowledge base. Added to that, we are also much more vulnerable to privatisation, to being siloed out into other private institutions. We work in partnership with them quite often, so we're not sure whether we're in private provision, working in partnership with private provision, fighting against private provision. And I would suggest that gives the university the impression that what we do is peripheral to the core academic focus of education. If we can be moved out, yes, we're important, but not as important as other forms of education. It's peripheral, it's still separate. It diminishes our educational and academic roles and the impact that EAP should aspire to. It connects us to profit. You know, private provision, the universities work with private providers because their marketing reach is much greater than the universities, and it brings in more students. And if we are part of that, then that's what our purpose is, rather than an academic endeavour. So structural positioning means that we don't know who we are, we don't know where we belong, we keep being shifted around, we're not clear, and we don't always have the voice on the committees that make those decisions. Okay, so structural position, can we move on, Nicola? Contract status, we feed into. I'm involved in interviews at the moment for temporary people to work with Leeds on the pre-sessional, very short-term contracts. Individual precarity feeds into our own precarity, and that fits back into our structural positioning that we don't know where we fit. So there's lots and lots of conversations going on about higher education entirely is in a precarious position at the moment. So Leeds is also going through voluntary redundancy, and it's not just the language centre that's impacted. So sometimes we're impacted within the broader sector, but then also there's kind of individual sort of centre sort of issues as well. This moved on to the next, So the precarious contracts also mean that we don't have access to all of the sort of development opportunities that we've got that might be available to others. But I think it runs deeper than professional development. It's about who, again, going back to the knowledge base, what are our qualifications? And again, when we're advertising at Leeds, we have ongoing discussions about what it is that we're asking people to come with in terms of qualifications. Usually it's an MA in TESOL, but TESOL is not the same as EAP. It's similar. An MA in Applied Linguistics is similar, but it's not everything. And there are not many MAs in EAP. Leeds has one, and we struggle to recruit because people have already got an MA in something else. So Doug Bell, at the same conference that Nicola and I met, argued that everybody in EAP should have a PhD. It would give us the academic authority necessary. I'm not arguing against that, but if you've done an MA in Applied Linguistics and then you do a PhD in a very, very, very focused thing, you're still lacking that broad knowledge base that we need as EAP practitioners. So we're kind of colluding with our own lack of academic authority by not having these clear pathways and routes through. not telling you I know what the answer is. So if we can move on to the next one, which is still talking about kind of qualifications. There are ways through. We can develop scholarship, but Davis's 2019 paper argued that, and I've had a conversation this morning about this, there's institutional lack of support for resourcing time and scholarship, particularly when we're under threat financially, because it's the first thing that goes, because it's where you can win in terms of money. Most papers, and a lot of papers now, are coming from the Chinese context around, because China moved from an English language curriculum to an EAP curriculum, but all of those papers are about individuals fighting to develop themselves. So the development opportunities are not resourced by the professional body or the institution. They're resourced by individuals doing it for themselves, which means that it's a bit ad hoc. You do what you are interested in, what you like. Lindsay Knox and the head SIG and Damien Fitzpatrick and his co-writers all looked at sort of broader elements of CPD. And what they found generally was that when we do CPD, it's kind of practice-based stuff. It's not developing our knowledge, our academic stuff. It's kind of like, how do we use this tech for teaching? So we're developing ourselves, but not developing ourselves as a profession, generally. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. I'm here representing Barleap as well as TEEP officer. We do have a competency framework that gives guidance as to what the competencies are needed. Some of them are knowledge-based, some of them are pedagogy, which is part of knowledge. But you have to do that by yourself. You can have a mentor, but you need to go off and do the learning and interpret those criteria within your own context. Carol McDermott and Lindsay Knox are doing some work that's been sponsored by Barleap and the TEEP scheme to look at how different people in the UK and in the Chinese context interpret and understand and experience those competencies and what they mean, because they are very contextual and you can interpret them differently. So I'm arguing that practitioner development is key to elevating our status, but at the moment it's not clear how we do that, how we develop in that way. And there aren't clear routes into it, there aren't clear sort of agreed ways of supporting it at institutional level. And I think here, and this is where you all say, no, we're already doing this in the TNE context and I just don't know. I think we can draw clear parallels between TNE and EMI contexts. I think especially many TNE institutions replicate academic structures taken from the UK, so the way that we're positioned and structured and organised is similar. I think what's different in the TNE context is that there are still hangovers and it creates a slightly different two-tier system. And this I've heard from people that have been applying for the TEEP fellowship and also from students that I've taught on the MA in teaching EAP, that there's a kind of hierarchy, and other colleagues, there's a kind of a hierarchy that works for both parties in different ways between the native speaker, UK-born English speaker, which is seen as valuable still in some contexts, but then people find their contractual status is, because they're not local, their contractual status is tenuous and sometimes they find themselves aged out. And then local colleagues who find it really hard to get work because they're not the native speaker. They quite often do have the PhD and the kind of academic qualifications, but their value as teachers is not seen as great. So it becomes a really complex area, I think, and that's, from Barleap and from the UK, we can't do anything about kind of contractual laws within other countries, and there's a lot of navigation around that needs to take place as well. Okay, so if we move on, again, I meant to put my timer on and I didn't. So I think so far, it's a slightly depressing picture. I think knowledge is the key to how to kind of navigate this. How do we get this sort of status? As Nicola said, there is an increasing interest in EAP, in EMI. Provision is positioned as necessary more and more by the literature, and it's necessary for practitioners to move from this peripheral media, sort of, you're doing language on the side. The students are just we're focusing on the the disciplinary lecturers and how to support them to lecture and teach in English. And then the students will just learn language sort of separately by osmosis. And I think increasingly there is this sort of shift into trying to work collaboratively with people within the discipline. And I know at Leeds that is happening, and in other centres it's starting to happen as well. Can we move on? So I think the position that we're starting with is that EAP expertise is central to EMI and TNE, and we need to make it clear that we are central in ways that we're not necessarily doing at the moment, without recognising EAP professionals as central partners. The efforts to enhance teaching quality and achieve sustainable internationalisation risks remaining superficial. So there's this growing acknowledgement that we need to be involved in decision-making processes. Can we move on? I think I'm almost at the end of my bit. There's a couple more slides. From this, though, to show this kind of academic authority, we need to start engaging in research around this and be involved in the research. And I think these are the sort of areas that we need to think and sort of start as an assumption of that EAP expertise is central to EMI, TNE. There is a lack of research, and that constrains the development of evidence-informed strategies that we can be involved in. And understanding this tension is critical for sustainable EMI implementation. We move on. So we've kind of got this contradiction between, it seems obvious that we should be involved, but we're not as involved maybe as we could be, we should be, because of the marginalised positioning within our institutions and this undervaluation of the impact that we can have on student success. But we need to be able to demonstrate it, not just say, we're language experts. Well, what does that mean? Most people think that means we teach grammar. We need to be clearer about what that means. We can't just say, oh, we're good teachers, because we're not the only good teachers in the institution. So what does it mean? We're not. Sometimes it seems like we are. So there is this lack of understanding in ourselves of where practitioner expertise should and could lie, as well as out there. We need to explain to people, but we need to be clear in our own sort of sense of identity as well. So the issues of professional status, institutional recognition and identity that exist in the UK and have done forever, we need to investigate and start to investigate very specifically now in the TNE EMI context, because that's where the growth area is for us. And I think, are we there with me? One more maybe.
Yeah, no, that was excellent timing, Bea. Thank you.
Okay.
It's difficult when someone's transitioning your slides. So that was really our starting point, that a lot of these issues that have been ongoing in Anglophone contexts in terms of the field of EAP are really pressing in emerging EMI and TNE contexts, and I think perhaps being overlooked in the emerging EMI research in non-Anglophone contexts. So we have a proliferation now of studies arguing for the need for ESAP courses, this movement from EGP to EAP and more disciplinary specific academic and language support for students, and on increased collaboration. Again, something that's been argued for decades in an Anglophone context, the need for professional development for EAP teachers, but really it's really exploring the institutional positioning of the EAP teachers in this overall strategic decision making. I mean, even in the TNE webinars that I've been attending recently, it's been interesting because there have been no EAP practitioner presence at all in any of the discussions. And I've also noticed this in meetings with ministries of education when there's discussions on policy implementation. Where is the EAP practitioner in all of this, who's really at the ground level at the forefront of this policy implementation at the classroom level, developing the curriculum, adapting the curriculum, meeting the students in the classroom, and first-hand experience of the challenges for both teachers and students. So really we wanted to explore how the institutional positioning and professional development of the EAP teachers in the Chinese context initially shape their work. And really it's an attempt to look at the overall professional reconfiguration of English language teachers in the EMI and TNE agenda globally, and to provide more evidence-based insights for repositioning EAP. within not just the institution, but the overall EMI and TNE policy agenda. So 2 research questions led the collection of Jingwen's data. So we collaborated with Jingwen here. The first is looking at initially just the roles and experience of EAP teachers in these different contexts and how they're recognised within the institutional structures. Is their voice heard? What role do they have in the implementation of these top-down level policies? And also, how do they experience at the moment and engage with professional development? And what are their needs in terms of professional development? As Bea mentioned, we only have 1 full master's in EAP in the UK at the University of Glasgow. So Carol leads the module on TEEP. But really, I think we also need to look now at the generic master's programme in the UK, and are we meeting the needs of our pre and in-service TESOL graduates that are now going to work in these contexts with expanding EMI and TNE provision. So as I mentioned, the focus of our study was China, where EMI and TNE expansion is growing. It's one of the largest higher education systems globally and a major site of both EMI and TNE, with 13 institutions in the study, 20 EAP teachers and also 5 PD leads, and from a range of different institutions. And Jingwen collected this data. There's also document analysis, and we've reported that in the article, but for the purpose of today and given the limited time, we've only chosen to report on the interview data here. So a number of things emerged from the analysis, really the organisational positioning of the EAP within the EMI structures, which has already been talked about today, and Bea gave the example of Sheffield as well, as movement from an external unit or a centre towards a faculty, and also the institutional recognition of the teachers. So what we found then was that the EAP units varied between applied linguistics faculty or foreign studies, but also independent language centres, so much like the UK context. This diversity in institutional affiliation reflects multiple structural models for EMI and TNE and how to organise the provision, but it also had important implications for how the teachers viewed their own professional status and also professional development opportunities. We also found a difference that EAP teachers located within language-focused faculties experienced greater disciplinary legitimacy, which is perhaps unsurprising, whereas those based in independent language centres run more privately were positioned more as service providers. But I think this is a really important starting place for us when we want to expand the reach of our work from the UK context into non-Anglophone EMI and TNE structures, and to make these comparisons as well. We found, as one of the participants notes here, being part of the faculty as other disciplinary departments gives us more academic recognition. Content departments are more willing to consult us because they see us as colleagues rather than just support staff or service providers. And this is really important because, as we know, this collaboration, team teaching, co-curriculum design is central to successful and sustainable EMI policy implementation. We have numerous calls for increased collaboration within departments. We're mainly seen as a service unit, although we deliver EAP courses. We're rarely invited to EMI curriculum meetings or programme design discussions. And I think this also resonates with my recent experience at TNE webinars as well, that when we have these higher level strategic decision making discussions, where are the EAP teachers and where is the language expertise to advise on this mass language transformation on a global level? So we have this structural separation, and this is perceived as creating barriers to cross-departmental communication. And again, as I mentioned, given that close collaboration between EAP and content teachers is widely regarded as a key indicator for effective EMI implementation, then these organisational arrangements really do need to be addressed. We found in only one institution that there was a PD programme for EAP teachers, and I think this relates to Bea's point about the lack of EAP PD. Also in non-Anglophone contexts, and the training that was offered was really quite generic and more about pedagogy, but not also about career development. And we'll come back to that. I've just picked some of the findings here. So we had a lot of challenges and directions for EAP PD. So we found that our teachers referred to their expanding and their hybridised professional roles. So more than half referred to this mediating role they have between disciplinary content expectations and then obviously helping students with their disciplinary literacy. They mentioned themselves as lack of specialised PD and need for it as well. And also this sense that their professional identity is evolving amidst this changing landscape as well. So we've had this movement from EGP to ESAP, but also now with increased TNE as well and different models of EMI. So the role of the English teacher really is changing. A lot of them also discussed different pathways for gaining this specialised knowledge, so seeking this themselves in the absence of targeted PD. There's one participant mentioned here, ESAP teachers should ideally understand both how to teach EAP as well as some basic disciplinary knowledge or the convention of oral. So, these results are unsurprising. We've seen results like this before. For example, teachers with knowledge of biology or chemistry would have more advantages compared to those with colleagues who know only about TESOL. And we do see a real rise in job recruitment ads in the Chinese context for English teachers with a background in science or a background in politics, for example. Another participant here, for example, when I teach ESAP for business, but I may not be particularly familiar with this field, so I have to spend a lot of time learning about the field by reading the textbooks. This was my own experience before I came back to the UK. I was working in Japan, in Japan's first EMI university as the ESAP coordinator, and I knew absolutely nothing about international business, and I had to collaborate with the business faculty. And we also had a lot of discussion on the institutional status hierarchies as well. So the career advancement is inhibited, so their roles labelled as teachers or language tutors, and they're rarely given the same privileges. There's a discrepancy in pay. The content teachers are given numerous rewards, incentives to teach on the EAP, the EMI programmes, given the fact that to translate their curriculum into the English language is time consuming, so they're remunerated for this, unlike the EAP teachers that also have to change their curriculum from EGP to ESAP, but they're not giving such rewards for doing so. There was also an aspiration for a higher academic status within the university, this feeling of wanting to escape from their current roles, to be seen as more professional and as an academic, which I think is really key and is important if we want to position the EAP teachers into a more strategic role in the overall university decision-making process. So they described having this dilemma of being trapped in teaching year after year without working hours to enhance their research abilities. I knew a content teacher who obtained her PhD in linguistics recently. She was an EAP teacher a few years ago. She works in the education department, saying goodbye to our School of Language. Perhaps she thinks this, the Language Centre, is not a good environment for her career development, and now she can do more research and become an academic. So I have this reflection. It's necessary for us EAP teachers to find our own specialities and to show our voice, especially in the academic community. But then obviously, in order to do so, they need time. And we have the issue of being on a teaching contract or a minimal hours contract. For the majority of us, the EAP teachers, we should accept the reality that we have to teach for many hours year by year. This was my own experience in Japan with my workload. It's quite miserable, and accepting misery is also part of our characteristics. There was a desire, despite this, a desire to do research. So one of the participants who holds both a PhD and an ED believed that the cultivation of researching and publishing skills that we do not see on EAP PD courses at present can significantly promote the career development of EAP teachers. My experiences of EAP teachers are not researchers, they'll be stuck in teaching. and be referred back to the Ningbo conference. And I remember being quite shocked at one of the key presenters noting that even though EAP teachers didn't have time allocated in their workload, they should be doing this in their own time, which I thought was quite a problematic statement to make at the conference. In terms of the PD leads, we had some comments here that I do think there's been a problem that content lecturers often feel that they're in a higher position. So we have this status, this tension between the status and the position. They think that way because of how they're placed within the university system. Language teachers are not lecturers, they're titled as teachers. So we would hope that all language teachers would take the lead in collaboration, but are we giving them the skills to lead, to collaborate, to have these, to manage the curriculum in the EAP PD, rather than just following the content teachers or being their assistants? So we have this persistent tension then between the EAP teacher's formal academic title made by the institution, and then their positioning, their self-positioning as being, peripheral teaching staff or a service provider. I'm just checking my time here. So going forward then, I think that we really need more critical inquiry into EAP teachers' engagement with professional development, but also what's covered on the professional development courses, but also how this is mediated by institutional hierarchies that also privilege research over teaching. But I'll come back to that in the Chinese context, because it's quite interesting when we look at the outputs in terms of EAP research in terms of China. So many of the participants expressed strong aspirations to develop their research expertise and their professional visibility, but also mentioned their heavy teaching loads, limited institutional recognition. The expansion of EMI in Chinese higher education has really elevated the pedagogical significance of EAP. As we mentioned, we have numerous studies now calling for the need to support students and also for professional development for the teaching staff. But we still have these tensions about the institutional recognition, the identity of EAP teachers, and also the legitimacy of EAP teachers. And how can we give them an elevate, or how can we facilitate them having a more elevated status in the overall decision-making within the university? So really then we call for a more central role of the institutional leadership and to include more EAP practitioner expertise. And we also found that some of the, again, unsurprisingly, the well-resourced EMI universities tended to adopt more strategic and integrated approaches to language support. So there was more provision, but not in terms of PD. And we found that this limited visibility of EAP provision in the joint colleges and also the programme-based EMI settings really mirrors earlier critiques that EMI expansion is often driven by market-orientated priorities with insufficient investment in language pedagogy and staff development. And I think this is a very, very short-sighted view and something that we really, really need to consider if we want a more long-term strategy towards TNE and how we can support our teaching staff to help implement this policy. Academic research training was scarcely available, so as we mentioned, only one of the universities had specialised EAP PD, but this didn't include academic research training, even though teachers actively linked research competence with their identity construction, their academic status, and their career advancement, which would then help to put them in this position that we feel they need to be in terms of internationalisation decision-making within the university. There was this resistance towards how they're titled. The EAP teachers are not researchers or lecturers, therefore they're stuck in teaching, making them inferior to the content teachers. EAP teachers' needs are overlooked due to their marginalised position within the university. It's interesting when we look in China, which is a very, very output-driven context in terms of research. And if we look at the EAP publications, so between 2001 and 2020, of 940 publications in the field of EAP, China actually ranks amongst the top 3 most productive countries. So our EAP practitioners in this context are doing research, and they are experts in this field, yet at the decision-making level within the institution, their voices are not being heard and they're not recognised as academics in their own right. So we really need to address the findings of our study really call for the need to address this imbalance between the content teachers and the EAP teachers within the university in terms of their treatment, their remuneration and the resources that they receive in terms of professional development within the university structure. We also need to address this hierarchical division within the institution that really restricts the EAP practitioners from having access to professional development. I think, B, am I moving to you now? Yes.
So, I think we're in the last slides, and I'm going to rush through the next 2 because I think that they're basically kind of summarising again what I've already said, that it's really, really important that we engage in scholarship as practitioners. I think the divide, there's still, and very specifically in China, a massive divide between those who are teaching EAP and those who are researching it. And we need to kind of try and close that divide. Yeah. I think I've unmuted myself. I have unmuted myself. Yes. So we need to kind of focus on this knowledge production of our own to kind of present ourselves as kind of serious players in the academic field. If we move on, Nicola. I have talked about EAP as a pharmacon, so as Alex Sting and Joan Turner, I think, was one of the first people that I read that have used it. This idea that EAP is both a poison and a cure within the academy. It works, it's always seen as a kind of like a fixer rather than a kind of an element of something that is a whole. And I think we collude in that it's ourselves because we're not clear about who we are and what we need to do. So we need to be asking existential questions about what our role, purpose and position is. It's all really complex and I don't necessarily have the answers. We are colluding in our own marginalisation. If we want to be taken seriously and have a seat at the table, we really need to be able to say what it is that we bring to that table in academic terms. And that comes through scholarship, through research and kind of having that academic authority. And that will give us a much more central role if we move on. So when we're thinking about EMI, T&E, we're going to leave you with questions because we've already said we don't have all the answers. This is the picture, sort of slightly depressing in some cases. We need to be thinking about who is it that leads this language transformation. So thinking about EMI and T&E and thinking about who's going to be involved. We need to take into account the cost of inadequate support, that it's going to, in the end, lead to reputational damage. And that's the point that we need to be making to these institutions, that if students don't have integrated communication, language support along with their discipline, they're learning knowledge without an understanding. And I think there's been a panic within our field around generative AI and that taking over the language work. Actually, I think it makes it as more powerful if we're clear about what it is that we do. If we're language fixers, teaching grammar, generative AI's taken our jobs. Students can do that without us. But if we focus on how communication works and how to do that effectively, then we can work with generative AI and we should be more powerful. We need to be involved in policy. So policy and practice need to be aligned. And we need to think about how we can do that, how we can be informing the policy and programme structures much more. And I think, is that the end? Yeah. So that's the kind of leaving message, that without these systematic efforts to reposition EAP practitioners as central internationalisation initiatives risk remaining superficial and unsuccessful.